Cyclones, fire, earthquakes, volcanoes. What happens to animals and even plants in the face of natural disasters? Some can sense the coming catastrophe and flee ahead of time. Others are forced to remain and battle against the odds to stay alive. Indigenous oral history and traditional knowledge is full of stories of nature's resourcefulness. Now, Western scientists are starting to study the ways animals and vegetation cope with the planet's moods and their remarkable strategies for survival. Many have managed to turn adversity to their advantage with some ingenious adaptations. Numerous animals and plants manage to survive and even thrive after catastrophic events. But as the planet warms and the frequency and intensity of fires, floods and cyclones increases, will nature continue to find ways to endure the Earth's wrath? Lying in the Indian Ocean, the island of Sri Lanka is a popular tourist destination, thanks to its stunning scenery, rich marine ecosystems, and its wide range of wildlife. In the south, Yala National Park is home to a variety of mammals, reptiles and birds. On the morning of December the 26th, 2004, tour guides like Thushara Peris had no idea of what they were about to witness.
We didn't see as many animals as usual that day. Normally, between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m., we see a lot of animals. But that day, there were not many. They were scared of something, but we couldn't figure out the reason for that.
The animals were aware of something no human could sense. But far away, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded struck off the coast of Indonesia and lasted for a full 10 minutes. Sri Lanka was far enough from the epicenter that the tremor itself couldn't be felt. But the earthquake triggered a series of tsunamis, giant tidal waves, along the coasts of Indonesia, India, Thailand and Sri Lanka, killing over 230,000 people. Fishermen at sea were out of the danger zone, but they too saw changes, as Himapala Leonagi discovered when he returned to his boat in the days following the tsunami.
We went fishing a few days after the tsunami, but the fish that we had seen before the tsunami weren't there. There were no big shoals of fish in the water. Before, we had seen crabs on rocks on the seabed, but they had also gone. We did not see the fish show their usual behavior at all. Even sea creatures like prawns and turtles disappeared during the tsunami and after the tsunami as well.
Many people in Sri Lanka believe that animals were able to sense the impending catastrophe and move out of harm's way. Since ancient times, stories have been told of animals warning humans of impending doom before it happens. Reptiles, geese and dogs have all been credited with saving us from various disasters, But until recently, there had been little scientific study of this phenomenon. Then in 2011, Dr. Martin Wikelski began studying the goats that wander the slopes of Mount Etna in Italy. Towering 3,352 meters above sea level, Mount Etna is the most active volcano in Europe. Most eruptions affect only the vicinity of the crater and pose little danger for locals and their animals. Over 2 years, Dr. Wikelski tagged a number of goats and sheep that live on the volcano's slopes, then kept a close eye on what the animals got up to. Using the data collected, he was able to see how their movements changed depending on the volcano's behavior.
What we saw was that before every major eruption, before every one of those, the goats were showing erratic, strange behavior. They were getting really nervous. But then when you have an eruption coming up, and we don't know what it is, but there's something coming from the earth mantle going towards the surface, and somehow the goats know. And that's really interesting because they are not in one group together. They're distributed around the mountain. And it's a very strong increase in activity. It's not just, wiggling around a little bit or walking around. No, it's a doubling or tripling of activity. And that's quite a massive difference.
Dr. Wikelski knows that the goats act differently before an eruption. Next, he needs to find out how they can tell that something is about to happen.
Well, the truth is, we don't know what it is that the goats experience, what they sense. But it's actually really interesting because we can now, collaborating with the volcanologists, find out where these correlations are. And then we can go out and say, well, could it be smell as the lava, as the magma comes up through the mountain? Is it more the tension in the mountain which they measure? And maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the CO2 that is influencing the plants, that is influencing the goats. But we don't know yet.
Wikelski has recently returned to the slopes of Mount Etna to improve on his first experiments, thanks to sophisticated tags that allow him to track their movements in real time.
So we did studies here before on the goats 6 years ago, studied them for 2 years, but only logged the data, so only wrote them in the memory of the tag. And now we have, for the first time, a real-time system, which is really exciting because now we can determine what the goats are doing when the mountain is going crazy. So from the previous data, we know that the goats are active 4 to 6 hours before a major volcanic eruption, which is really enticing. So within 10 minutes or so, we get the data from these animals and can tell whether they are going crazy or not.
Having confirmed that goats make good volcanologists, Wikelski now hopes to apply his knowledge to other animals.
The next steps are that we go to different parts of the world and ask people which animals are known to tell you something about disasters that are coming. And those will be the animals we tag with the people there and determine whether they are as good as the goats here.
The animals in Sri Lanka and the goats in Italy are not alone in figuring out that something is about to happen before it takes place. And one study has even identified the clues that some animals are picking up on. The O-Search organization was set up to help scientists collect data in the ocean. The deep sea and its many inhabitants remain largely misunderstood due to the difficulty of acquiring hard facts. Despite their high media profile, there is very little concrete information known about even some of the most recognizable animals, such as sharks. Dr. Robert Huter has been tagging various species of sharks for the last 35 years. In 2001, he and his colleague, Dr. Michel Heipel, had marked a group of young black-tipped sharks that were living in shallow water in Tampa Bay, Florida. But on September the 11th, Tropical Storm Gabriel formed in the Gulf of Mexico. 3 days later, it hit the Florida coast with winds of 110 kilometers an hour and heavy rainfall.
We had receivers, acoustic receivers, that were tracking the movements of about a dozen or so young sharks. When the storm approached our coast and when we downloaded the data, we saw that these little sharks had left the comfort and the confines and the protection of the nursery area and had gone out somewhere offshore into lower Tampa Bay, perhaps out in the Gulf itself, where they're actually vulnerable to being eaten themselves by larger sharks. What's plotted here in the hashed area is the times when the 13 blacktip sharks left the nursery. But they began to leave with the downturn in barometric pressure and were fully gone even before barometric pressure hit its bottom point.
The sharks reacted to the low pressure associated with hurricanes rather than the wind and rain.
It's actually sensed in the sharks, we now know, in their ears. And yes, sharks do have ears. They have inner ears that can pick up the pressure difference that's associated with depth. Some of the animals reacted very quickly. After this happened, a few others took, an hour or so to kind of make the decision it's time to leave.
20 years after Dr. Huter's first observations, an O-Search team set off on an expedition to Nova Scotia to tag and follow the movements of great white sharks. When they arrived in September 2020, the location was ideal for finding sharks and the weather was beautiful.
But they were clearly gone. They had left. They were avoiding that area and staying offshore.
It seems the sharks had sensed something, and sure enough, shortly after Hurricane Teddy pummeled the Nova Scotia coast, the calm seas of the tagging site were soon transformed by 10-meter waves. From his previous work on black-tipped sharks, Dr. Huter was able to make deductions about the great white sharks in Nova Scotia.
By inference, we conclude that the sharks that could have been there in that very productive place left, rode it out offshore in deeper water, and then when the hurricane effects were pretty much cleaned up, returned, and that's when we found them several days later, a little bit further down the coast.
When the sharks returned, the team was able to catch and tag them. Unlike goats, the shark tagging operation requires a large team of experts and a huge amount of logistics. Using an elevated platform, the shark is towed into place and the specialists set to work. Like a Formula One pit stop, each person on the team is responsible for their task, which they try to perform as quickly as possible to limit the distress to the animal. Samples are taken and the shark is tagged before being sent on its way. Dr. Huter and his colleagues follow 70 great whites in real time and can observe how they react to changing barometric pressure and incoming weather disturbances.